Good afternoon. It is Monday, August 5th, 2019, and this is part 3 of my explaining my saga of being a targeted individual for 11 years. And I ran out of video space, so part 2 was abruptly cut off at an awkward point. So what I had been explaining is how I had begun to be exposed to really terrible toxic chemicals that created this whole range of bizarre symptoms, and I developed hyperallergies. Higher up in DuPont explained to me what a hyperallergy is, which is, he said it would happen on the floor, factory floor, when employees of DuPont would be working with certain chemicals, and suddenly the body just couldn't take it anymore, and it was like a reboot happens, so that they couldn't work on the floor anymore, and even just to walk in the door might cause them to go into anaphylactic shock. In other words, even a few molecules of a certain chemical, you can just develop this extreme reaction to, and your body just won't tolerate them anymore. So that's what had happened to me. And there's just a lot of people on fringe underworld or NSA or something or other that just are happy with being part of this cabal to harass and publicly oppress a targeted individual when they're out and about by maliciously putting a chemical either on their person or a purse or a piece of paper and then trying to expose you to it. And then pretend like you're crazy when you back away or ask them to. So at this point, I had been running out of money, not unable to find work because I was constantly on the run, and in a homeless shelter for a few months. And then one day I spent the night in a hotel, and I didn't notify them that I was going to do that, and that was a breach of policy, so I could no longer stay at the homeless shelter. And so I was advised to seek another homeless shelter that had openings. Well, let me make a correction. At the Eugene Mission, you have to, if you do an infraction like that, then you can't stay there for a week or so, and then you can come back in. But I needed a place to stay, and so I had just enough money on the recommendation of a social worker, and I went down to Coos Bay to the homeless shelter there, where I stayed a number of months. And at some point I realized that they were actually drugging the beverages to kind of dumb down and mellow out the homeless people there. And so I found that to be really sinister, so I sought other lodgings. I had other occasions of the same sort of pattern happening where I was gaslighted into a housing situation, rental situation, and then they would start gaslighting me, and I would find the chemicals in my belongings again. And so at one point I fled back to another, it was just not as well-funded homeless shelter, and I just did not want to go back to that first one because of the food contamination. This other shelter, you could only stay for a week, and I had not enough money and didn't know what to do. And so one of the directors there invited me to come stay with him. And later I found out that that's illegal, and that's a breach of contract if you're working as a social worker. And so this guy seemed, again, very, very nice at first, and then he too started poisoning me pretty horrifically. And his place was kind of far out, so it really became like a hostage situation. And eventually he went on a weekend trip, and I called the police to come and help me. I had a little money for at least a few nights, and then enough to catch a bus back to Eugene. And I asked them, to find a safe shelter for me. And what they did is they drove me to this very sleazy flop house on the edge of town that I already knew had a bad reputation, and they dropped me there. And so the owner was he was very bullying, and kind of like a little Hitler. And so I went to my room, and at this point I had no clean clothes left, and so there was a mall across the street, and I had enough money to go and buy some clothes, but I had to kind of go like on a relay race. I can't remember exactly why. Maybe it's because my shoes were contaminated, so I had to go get shoes first, and then so I went back and forth to the store a few times, and then by the time I came back, the third time, my room had been contaminated, the bath towels, and later I found out that my half-drunk bottle of wine had been drugged. And so I looked around for the maid, and I couldn't see her, and there was the open door to the maid's supply room, and there were just towels. You could just lean in and reach and grab a towel. So I went and I did that, and pretty soon I hear a knock on the door, and it's the manager, or maybe it was a call on the phone that I was to come down, and he told me that I hadn't breached all these rules and stolen a towel, and I don't know, some weird rule about running across the parking lot or something. It was just like this whole litany of bizarre, trumped up charges against me. And he told me that I would have to leave the next day. And I had paid him, I had made a deal with him that I paid him $100 for 4 nights, and I said I want my money back then for those other 3 nights, and he's like, too bad. So it was just a setup to, and later I realized that he was in cahoots with the local law enforcement. And so I went back to my room, and I had a few glasses of the drugged wine, and then I got angry. And there was something in that wine that just completely took away inhibition, and it was like Tourette's. I had Tourette's syndrome, and I went back down to the office, and I just had had it anyway with all the abuse I'd been fielding for so long, and I just let loose on him, and I was like, "You are a coward. You are such a coward to do this to me. How dare you?" And then he said, "Fine, I'm calling the police and kicking you out of here." And so I went back to the room, and pretty soon here came the police knocking on the door, and I explained my situation, and they said, "Well, okay, maybe you can stay for the night." And they went away. And then I went back to the club owner, and again I was angry at him, and it was the wine. If I hadn't had drugged wine, I wouldn't have done that. And so he called the police again, and they dragged me off to jail. And so this was the middle or late in the night now, and they said that all the cells were filled, and so they handcuffed me to a table. They handcuffed my ankle to a table chair, where I was to sit on the floor all night, handcuffed to the chair. And so there was my chemical sensitivity, and my sensitivity to metals. And here was this metal cuff around my ankle, burning and scorching me. And I started screaming and yelling. And then eventually, after about 3 hours of this, they put me in this weird cell that was like in the center of their office room, and it was, the top half was glassed on 4 sides, and it was just a cement holding cell with 1 rubber mat, and no bathroom, no privacy, and there was the police officers coming in and going across the hallway from their office. And so there they kept me. They let me out to use the bathroom about 7 or 8 in the morning. And I asked, well, when do I get let out? And they said, well, you have to have the alcohol in your blood completely out of your body before, and so you'll do a breathalyzer test, and when that's reads 0, then you can go. And so they led me back into that cell room, and the cell room had been poisoned. And it was this chemical that extremely dried and burnt your skin. It caused choking, asthmatic feeling, like my breath was being choked out, and a terrible parching thirst. And, so I kept saying, there's something that's been put in this cell. I'm having a really strong reaction to it. You have to let me out. I'm in fear for my life. I'm having trouble breathing. And they ignored me for hours. And at one point, a female officer had a big, tall, frosty drink. And she just sauntered right up to the glass window and just took long sips of her refreshing, cold, frosty drink right in front of me, and then sauntered back to her desk. And eventually, I just then went into sort of a Zen stillness to survive. And I stood there stock still in Wonder Woman position with hands on my hips until noon is when about then was when they finally let me go. And so I found a hotel where I could stay the night. I had started working at a nursery, and so I had some money coming from that nursery, and I talked the boss into just giving me cash, so I had enough money to stay another night at a hotel and get a bus and head back to Eugene. And so I went back and I stayed in the homeless shelter for a while. And at that point, my father decided that he would set up in advance a little trust for me so I could have some subsistence living. And so the next couple of years in Eugene, I ran a similar gauntlet between bed and breakfasts and rentals. And then over the last year and a half or so, I started to get assaulted, not just by people sneaking into my private quarters and leaving poisons and gases, but as actually assaulted by electromagnetic chemical weapons that can pierce right through walls, ceilings, and floors. There's a vast network of underground rooms and passages under Eugene, and I can actually hear their voices as they're having conversations. And I recognize the same voices as they've tracked me from property to property. They have some kind of wall-penetrating visual devices that enables them to track you as if you're walking on a glass floor in a glass house. And drones and cell towers can assault from the air as well. And so I ran a gauntlet. At one point, they weren't afraid to leave wounds that are really visual. So I went through a whole gauntlet of horrific bloody contusions and rashes, injuries that would last sometimes days, sometimes weeks at a time. And they began to rape me with these weapons. And so at one point, I decided to call the police after getting out of this particularly egregious situation, and I still had a lot of nasty contusions and sores on my arms and legs. And I asked them if they could meet me in a store parking lot. And so they appeared, and I immediately showed them the wounds on my arms and said, I'm a victim of assault. These are electromagnetic chemical weapons. You can see the injuries. And the officers even said, one of them, yep, those look like wounds from electrochemical magnetic weapons to me. And they had told me the moment that they showed up that there was no need for me to make a written report because they were capturing it all on their body cams. And so for the next almost an hour, I went into a detailed account of what was going on. I was clear, articulate, coherent, as I hope you find me now. And we wrapped it up, And that was that. I didn't hear anything more from them. I think about a week went by, and I called the police and I said, what's going on with this case? I'm not hearing back from you guys. And and it became clear that it was important for me to, like, they were trying to make it out like it was a non-issue. And so I said, well, I want to take a look at that video camera recording, because I can't see how you could possibly draw that conclusion. And so they directed me to the records department, and I asked for the video recording, and I was told I wasn't permitted to have it. And instead they gave me what was the officer's written report based on that recording. And the written report by that officer that interviewed me was full of distortions. It was just 1 page long, and it made me out to look like a sort of a lewd, deluded prostitute that was making the whole thing up for attention and less than noble reasons. So I was frustrated and outraged, and I demanded once again to receive the recording. And what ensued was this whole sort of legal rigmarole and bureaucracy twists and turns. And I eventually enlisted Patty Perlow, the district attorney, to assist me. And thanks to her, I was able to obtain something. And what it was not the full visual audio recording. I wasn't permitted the visual. They provided me with a recording that had most of our interview, but they had cut out that comment of the police officer agreeing with me as to the nature of how I had received the wounds. And in the recording, I sounded, as I knew I would, clear and coherent, and nothing like what that written report was. And so my only other option at this point was to make an appeal at the police auditor's office, which is not an elected body, and it's all very insider. And so I made a very meticulous report, pinpoint targeting each of the areas, which was almost every sentence in that officer's report about me, where he was in error, and asked them to refer to the video where they would see his inaccuracies based on what I had said. I also included a lot of photos of all the wounds I had received and put it in a portfolio and submitted it. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from that officer who I had interviewed with, superior officer, and he said he'd looked at my material, he had interviewed the officer, and he told me that I was mentally imbalanced and I should go seek therapy. So that was the end of that episode with the police. There's just a couple more points I want to, or experiences I want to share, and then I'll wrap this up. I moved to a new property where once again I was assaulted from beneath the floor, and I could tell the direction, from the direction of where the voices and the sounds of their movements were coming from, that it was always from a specific direction, and it looked like it could be the neighboring house. And indeed, the house actually had a car parked out front that never moved, and it had a huge rubber jellyfish hanging from the rearview mirror. And so I had pretty much given up that the police, on any hope that the police would ever help me. But one night, I heard a woman screaming, and it sounded like it was coming from the direction of that house. And it lasted for 15 minutes, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And so for the first time in Oregon, on my return, and possibly ever, I don't think I ever called 911 at any time while I was in Oregon, but I called for her because I had no false sense of security. I assumed that kind of screaming, they were doing to her what they'd been doing to me. And at this point, the assaults were so intense. I had actually attempted to lie aluminum siding on my mattress and underneath the bed, and on the floor of my bathroom, thick enough that you could line a rabbit hutch with it, that kind of material. And the electrochemical weapons would shoot right through that. And in fact, they made little like tenting dents, sort of like when you see somebody shooting a BB gun at a stop sign, and you get those little protrusions on the other side. So there was that level of assault happening, causing me a lot of bruising, damage, etc. And I had found that the safest place for me was a metal clawfoot bathtub in the bathroom. So I spent a lot of my final days in that house, huddled in that bathtub. And that's where I was that night. And so I was in a little efficiency. I didn't have a lock on my door. So, people could come in and out of from the other part of the house if they wanted to. So I wasn't feeling very secure at that point. And so I called and I told them, I think it's coming from the house next door. Could you check it out? And so they said they would. About 45 minutes went by, and the screaming had tapered off, and then it started again. And so I called 911 back, and I said, I'm the person that called regards to the woman screaming. She's still screaming. Did the police not come out? And she said, oh, they came out and they found nothing untoward, nothing wrong, nothing more we can do. And she hung up. And again, at that moment, I lost it, because that woman was still screaming. So I called the police, 911, again and again and again. And they just kept hanging up on me. Eventually, I gave up. The woman's screams died away. A short while later, it was now the early morning hours, two fully uniformed officers carrying weapons walked into my bathroom. They didn't knock. They didn't announce their arrival. The landlady just let them in and showed the way up to my room. And they told me that I was in violation of improper use of 911. And there was a woman officer and a male officer. The woman officer was in front, hovering in the bathroom door. The other male officer leaned over her shoulder and said, "She doesn't look like she's wearing any pants." Now, I was in my nightgown, and the moment I saw them coming in, I sat bolt upright, tucked my knees, I was sideways in the tub, tucked my knees up and pulled my nightgown over my knees. And still that male police officer felt he had to say that. So she began interrogating me, and she read me my rights and told me what the violation was and started asking me questions, which I just rigidly just sat very still. At one point, the male officer leaned in past the female officer's shoulder and put a pair of my pants on the toilet seat. And I didn't know what that was about. I didn't even recognize them as my pants. I thought that was just like maybe the female officer's jacket or something like that. And then he started rummaging around. I saw him walking back and forth behind her, rummaging around through my stuff. And eventually she's like, "Well, why aren't you answering my questions?" And I said, you told me that I would get in trouble if I spoke, so I'm not going to say anything, and that's all I said. And so eventually she issued me a ticket stating that I would have to pay a fine of almost $400 and possibly do some jail time for the improper use of 911. And they left. I curled back into a fetal position in the bathtub, and then I'll refer back to my hyperallergy is that I can lean into objects and my ear passages close. So I'm hypervigilant, especially when hostile strangers invade my home in the middle of the night. And as they were leaving, I was like, did the officer forget her jacket, pointing to the blue garment on the toilet seat the male police officer had left? And he said, no, those are your pants. And so when I got up in the morning, I leaned into those pants and my ear passages closed as I put my ear up next to the crotch of my pants. And I went through all the pants in my apartment, and that police officer had rummaged in my drawers and had smeared poison in the crotch of all my pants. Fortunately, I had a pair of leggings in the tub with me, so I could put those on and do laundry and clean the poisons that the police officer had left. One place that I missed, however, is when he rummaged in my purse to get out my driver's license so they could get the number to put on the citation. He had smeared a poison so toxic on the side of the purse that when I put the purse on my shoulder, my upper underarm got a horrible chemical burn. Horrible. And so, I went to court at the appointed time. They appointed me a defending attorney, and it took me 6 months and about 4 different visits to the courtroom until they dropped all the charges. So now I want to just talk about, at one point, I think it was a little over a year ago, before the district attorney, Patty Perlow, helped me in regards to getting the police recording, I attended a hate crime symposium at the U of O Law Center in a lecture hall that sat easily 100 people, and it was mostly full. And there were 3 different panels. The first one was a government panel. The other 2 were community leader panels that various departments put together to try to help and assist people having to deal with hate crimes. The whole symposium was overseen by sort of a PR person for the police for the entire state of Oregon. And the first panel represented were District Attorney Patty Perlow, the county prosecutor, an FBI representative from DC, and a leading head of the department of the Eugene Police Department. And so each of them had a little talk, and all of us in the crowd were just struck by how self-congratulatory each of these departments were and how they felt they were handling hate crimes. And then there was the Q&A session after that. And just about every questioner clearly seemed appalled at the disconnect and the gaslighting that we had all just exhibited by these very insular departments who were clearly not doing their job. And so when it came time for me to ask my question, I said, I have appealed to every one of your departments repeatedly, and each one of your departments either ignored me, lied to me, or gaslighted me. And so my question for you is, who holds you accountable when you are in dereliction of duty? And only Patty Perlow answered. She said, I'm elected official. If you don't like how I'm doing my job, you can fire me and elect somebody else. And so after that first panel took a break, we all went out and milled around and talked to each other and had a little buffet. And the spokesperson for the police, for the overseer of this whole event, approached me. And he apologized, and he said that he didn't feel that the panel had answered my question adequately, and he wondered if there was any way I could be of service, which, you could have blown me over. In the slightest breeze. I was so in shock that a representative of the police would actually seek me out and ask if they could be of service. And so I explained my targeted individual situation. And he was familiar with this type of issue, and he said, unfortunately, it's not a police matter, it's an FBI matter. And the problem with that is that in a smaller state like Oregon, there's only 2 or 3 people appointed to this type of issue, and so you're at the mercy, he said something to the effect of, you're at the mercy of the personalities there, which kind of seemed to say not so many words. They're probably corrupt, and that's why you're not getting any assistance. And he then went on to say that he would contact the district attorney on my behalf and a couple other agencies, and then he would call me back in a few days with further information. And I never heard from him again. So that's how it stands. That I am assaulted almost every waking moment of my day from the floorboards beneath my apartment, and assaulted when I go out and about in ways that I've mentioned before. And so I'm hoping that there is a sea change happening in our body politic as people become more aware and wake up to the corrosive nature. There have been 2 mass shootings within hours of each other in 2 different states. Over 30 people murdered in cold blood by youths that are out of control with these deadly weapons, living in a society where there's no accountability for this kind of horrible behavior. And just to reiterate what I said at the beginning of part 1, I have actually overheard these youths more than once say, a cop taught me how to do this, in regards to their ability to stalk and assault with deadly electrochemical weapons innocent civilians in the United States of America. Okay, I will bring this to a close now. Thank you for caring and listening.